G'day, Geoff Lewis here from Seriously Series, and I'm out in the Australian outback once again, taking the Series 2 Land Rover for a little bit of a walk. But today on this episode of Trip Preparation, what I wanted to look at is field repairs or field servicing. Because let's be honest, these vehicles, you do have to do a bit of maintenance when you're out in the bush or out in the field. So what are the common things that you need to look out for? What are the common spare parts that you might need to take with you? And what are some of the experiences that I've had over the years that you yourself might learn from? So that's what we're going to try and answer in this following episode. So if this sounds like a video that's of interest to you, then you know what to do. Stay tuned. Rightio, so I've gone ahead and I've actually made a bit of a list here. Now, the reason being is I could easily get stuck on stories and tales and all the rest, and I think that's probably worth leaving for another episode in another time and another space. But what I've got here are probably the common, and I say common, things that I've had to deal with over the years. I guess over the last sort of 14 years or so. So everything that I'm going to tell you here today is from experience. It's not fact. Sorry, it's not fiction, it's fact. That's what I wanted to say. I've got my words mixed up this morning. Obviously need another cup of tea. Anyway, so the first one I've got on my list is clearing out the sediment bowl. Now, the sediment bowl, for those of you who aren't aware, is actually situated on the fuel pump. Oh, didn't see that happening. And basically what this sediment bowl does, and it's fascinating, you know, it's so simple but yet so effective. What it actually does is any, I guess, sand or water that comes in, obviously flows into the sediment bowl. All the rust in the sand sinks down to the bottom, and obviously the water does too, so that sits at the bottom, the fuel sits on the top, because obviously, as we know, oil is lighter or has a less density than water. Now, having said all that, you can probably guess what I'm going to say next. Well, all that crud that's in there, and it is a technical term, crud, will then obviously try and invade its way into the fuel pump and into the fuel line up into your carburetor. And then that's going to cause a huge amount of catastrophes. So what you need to do is, I like to, particularly if I'm in a remote area, I like to check it once a day. And I don't necessarily have to take it off, but I like to lie under the vehicle, regardless, have a look over absolutely everything. Are there new oil leaks? If there is, are they weeps or leaks? As I've explained in our Service 4x4 episodes. And then I'll look at the sediment bowl, and I'll just look at virtually the bottom of it, and I'll see, is that rust? Is it sand? Does it look a bit clear? Is it water? And then I'll see how much is in there. And because I'm checking it every day, I can kind of measure if it's obviously, if there is dust getting into the fuel or if it is bad fuel. And so if it keeps building up, then obviously I'll make sure I do it at the end of the day, as I've explained in other videos, because then I can get my little campfire ready and then just chuck the waste petrol on it, chuck a match on it, and hey presto, I've got a fire. So that's one of the things I would really suggest looking at is, you know, sediment bowls, or checking the sediment bowl. And everything that I'm talking about here today is sort of pertaining to obviously working in very remote areas. So, you know, if you're doing a nice little jaunt around Tasmania, or I don't know, probably even certain parts of the United Kingdom, you know, you guys and girls who reside in that part of the world, let us know. But I don't think obviously getting bad fuel and having to worry about dust and muck in the sediment bowl should be too much of a concern, but you never know. This is probably one that sort of, I guess, fits right across the board, and this is the steering arms on the steering relay, and obviously the steering box too. Now once again, I've talked about this in servicing 4x4 episodes, and obviously in the latest episode, or episode 4, sorry, of our Golden Quest series, because I had some issues with the steering in the series 2. And basically what can happen is all the bolts that are actually on here and the nuts, or more so the nuts actually, I always get those two mixed up, aren't nylock nuts. They're helical nuts and cone nuts. And they work generally pretty well, but they do come loose over time. And corrugations is your number one enemy in this vehicle. So they become ever so slightly loose, the pinch bolts on the actual steering arm, just literally in here, at the top and the bottom of the steering relay. And when that happens, obviously when you turn the steering wheel, it remains stationary until the slack's taken up, and then it'll actually move. So this means obviously with the steering wheel, it's pretty vague at the best of times, but it becomes even vaguer. So it means you're doing like half a turn of the steering wheel, and I'm exaggerating a bit, for you just to start actually moving the front wheel. So, if you're getting that and you're feeling a bit of sort of, I guess, not a constant amount of tension in the steering wheel when you're turning it, then you know that something's loose within the steering system or the linkages. So that's something you need to be mindful of. The other thing that you need to keep an eye on is the two bolts, and two bolts. I'll rephrase that, sorry, mind blank there. There's 4 bolts, that hold in the steering box. 2 bolts obviously go into the actual steering box itself. The other 2 bolts, they go through and they've got nuts on them. They're the 2 lower ones. They will come loose over time too, because you're constantly twisting, turning, and the whole steering box moves just a little bit, and over time they slowly come loose. And particularly corrugations, once again, will make them come loose a lot quicker. So once again, you'll have vague steering, but with that what you'll hear is a slight knocking noise. So you'll turn it sort of half a turn or quarter of a turn, and you'll hear just a very subtle knock, and then do the same again, knock, 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 knock. And the best thing to do there is to pop the bonnet, obviously when you're in camp, open up the driver's side door, provided your steering wheel's on the right side of the car, as it is here in Australia, and then obviously get the steering wheel with one hand, your left hand, and just look at the steering box. And all you want to do is just move it, the steering wheel, and you'll actually see the box twisting and turning. And if you see that, then you just know you need to nip up those bolts, and your steering's all good. So that's one that's pretty critical, because you can't really go very far without steering, can you? Not at all. The next thing that I'd suggest is always take a hub spanner with you. And I talked about this in the previous episode of Trip Prep. But where are you going to use it, and why are you going to use it, I think is a question that needs to be answered. You're going to use it primarily on your front wheel bearings, not on the rear. And the reason being is, if you think about it, back to steering once again, is as you're going round a corner, for example, let's say we're doing a left-hand turn, your right-hand wheel is going to get all the pressure on it, because the car's actually going to want to go straight, but you're trying to turn it off to the left. So this will cause the wheel to actually be, or the bottom of the wheel to be pushed in and the top to be pushed out. So you'll actually get more wear and tear generally, and this is just from my experience, on your front wheel bearings. This means that obviously the cage that the wheel bearings or the bearing elements are actually in will slowly wear over time. And when it wears, obviously the preload that you've set many months ago becomes irrelevant, because the wheel bearing's weared, it's changed, and therefore it's become sloppy. So what you need to do is obviously check your front wheel bearings, check your rear wheel bearings, I would say probably every couple of days, and just check that preload on them. Another top tip, which is really important, particularly in hot climates, that I've found, is get 2 fingers like this, And basically what you want to do is when you've stopped after a long stint, just get your 2 fingers and just touch it on the hub. And if you're a bit suspect, just put your hand out near the hub and just see how hot it is. And what you should be able to do is get your 2 fingers and place it on top of the hub, and you should be able to keep it there for about 30 seconds. And it should just feel nice and warm. If it's feeling hot and you've got to take your fingers off, then you know that you've done up that wheel bearing, or the preload on that wheel bearing is too great. And that means that continuing on with your trip, you're running the risk of actually that bearing overheating, failing, and then you're going to have to replace it. So that is a critical top tip, a pearl of wisdom, you could say. So that's very important. Now, the next thing that I mentioned, I guess, in the previous episode, but really needs to be driven home, is points, or feeler gauge for the points. Now, obviously, as you know, this is a petrol-derived Series 2 Land Rover, and many of you out there that have diesel Land Rovers will go, oh, I don't need to take a set of feeler gauges with me. Well, just listen, and you may learn something here if you like. The feeler gauge, or a good set of feeler gauges, can be used on a number of components in this vehicle. Now, to give you an idea of this, or an example, when Damon and myself drove right across Australia in this Series 2 Land Rover, we entered Melbourne. We came from Tassie, hopped on the ferry, went to Melbourne. And Melbourne is a pretty big city here in Australia. I can't remember how many million people are in it, but it must be getting close to sort of 4 to 5 million now, which is pretty big by Australian standards. And so it was quite unnerving at the best of times driving a vehicle of this nature through heavy traffic. But what made it even more interesting is the fact that I only had the use of 2 gears. I think it was first and third. And that was because we'd had the unfortunate event of a detent bearing getting jammed in the gearbox. And anyway, cut a long story short, I fixed it, but I also adjusted the bolt, had to readjust the bolt for reverse. There's like a bolt that stops it going too far so it doesn't jam. And what you have to do is you actually have to use a feeler gauge in there. So I didn't use it on the motor, I used it on the gearbox. And there's many other components in the gearbox that you need a good set of feeler gauges. Now, the likelihood of that happening is very remote, but at the same time, you really don't want to be caught out. So a good set of feeler gauges, they don't weigh much, they really don't cost much, so I'd definitely be chucking them in. Now, an example that I tend to have to do, I wouldn't say on a regular basis, but I've had to do it on a couple of trips now and then, is obviously reset the points. These obviously wear over time because there's a plastic heel in there, so I'll actually have to do it out on the dirt track or whatever. I usually try and wait till the end of the day, set up camp, do it first thing in the morning when I'm all fresh and rosy and ready to start the day of trekking around. So that's certainly one that I would recommend. You'll generally find too that after about 1,000 kilometres you'll have to reset it, and you'll have to continually do that too. But how often do you do 1,000 kilometres in a Series Land Rover these days? Not that often. Now, many of you will say on that subject to get an electronic, ignition module. Now, the reason why I don't use them is not because I think they're bad, but it's because if one of them fouls up and I don't have a suitable replacement, or that replacement fails, then I'm completely and utterly snookered. I can't get out of that situation. If I have a set of points, then I can file it using emery cloth. I can do many things to actually keep the car functioning. Not running well, but just functioning. So that's one of the reasons why I don't use those on the Series Land Rovers that we have here. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is suspension. Now, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that the punishment that gets unleashed on your vehicle, probably I would say nearly 80% of it is actually on your suspension components. So having good leaf springs, good shock absorbers, and actually going through and just replacing everything is absolutely critical if you're wanting to do a big trip. It's just not worth the risk at all. We run polyurethane bushes here, and it's a bit of a sore point for some. Some people don't like them, some people love them. I've run them in this vehicle for 12 years and they're still fine, not a problem at all. So I think they're fantastic in the sense of when you're out in the bush, you can change them really easily if a failure occurs. And I generally carry a couple bushes in the car with me, just in case that happens. But the likelihood of you having a suspension bush fail, provided that you've replaced them all recently, is, I guess it's about the same chance as getting struck by lightning. It's pretty remote, but it could happen. What's more likely to occur is U-bolts. U-bolts are something that you have to watch very, very carefully. And depending on what terrain that you're going on, and once again I'm talking of rough, hard corrugations like the Canning stock route, you need to be checking them pretty much every single day. Now there's a couple of methods that people suggest, and they suggest that you get a paint pen and you obviously put a mark on the nut and a mark on the spring plate, and then you'll be able to see if it comes undone. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But it doesn't take into account the fact that these U-bolts actually stretch over time. So yes, your nut might be in the exact position where it originally was, but your U-bolt may have stretched maybe half a mil or so. So you haven't got the pressure on there that you need to stop that spring plate and the spring itself from shifting around. So I wouldn't recommend doing that. Fact of the matter is, you just got to get down and dirty, get under your vehicle and actually just test them every day. You don't need to get a massive steel, pinch bar and put on it and put all your weight and force on it every day. No, you just need to go underneath there, put the actual spanner on and just push it gently with your hand, and you'll feel it. You'll feel that there's significant tension on it, or there isn't enough. If you don't have that tension on it, what actually happens, as I suggested earlier, is the spring plate actually shifts and moves. And when that happens, obviously like any piece of steel or toffee, it actually flexes. And as it flexes, there's obviously fatigue fractures occurring. This gets to a certain point and then the U-bolt itself snaps. Now when the U-bolt snaps or the U-bolts come loose, it puts stress on your other suspension components. Now, the other key component that we need to think about and focus on is the centre bolt. And I've talked about this in other servicing 4x4 episodes. I know I keep bringing it up, but it is a very good series and it's well worth watching if you haven't already. And you can do so by clicking on the link that's popped up at the top of your screen right now. But maybe just finish this video first, up to you. But the centre bolt goes through the centre of the leaf pack, and on a Land Rover it holds all those leaves together and it keeps them located, so it stops them from moving backwards and forwards and shifting around. With the U-bolts loose, it means that the actual axle assembly can move around. Now, the bolt itself, or any bolt, is designed to obviously have an effective use of applying pressure. It doesn't have any lateral strength at all. It means it can't take any force that's moving backwards or forwards. It'll actually shear the bolt, and that's exactly what happens. So 9 times out of 10, if you break a U-bolt, or a number of U-bolts, you really want to check the centre bolt in there too. Now, if you haven't got a centre bolt with you, don't worry. You can actually get out of trouble, and I've done this myself too. You can get a standard bolt, making sure that it has a nice thick head on it, and you can actually put it through the actual leaf pack and then tighten the nut up nice and tight. Take the whole leaf pack out of the car because you're going to do that anyway, and then you can just virtually sit it in front of you, either on the front of the vehicle or down on the ground, and put it in between your feet, and you can just work around that hexagon head with the file and then make it so it's roughly around about the right diameter to fit into the axle assembly. Now there's a trick on how to do that too. Before actually putting the bolt into the leaf pack, make sure you've got like some paint, or you can even get a bit of ochre out here, which is like a kind of iron based powder. Mix it with some water and put it on top of the bolt head. Go underneath the vehicle and push it up to where it needs to locate in the axle assembly, and then pull it down, and you'll actually have the perfect circumference of what the bolt head needs to be, because you've got that imprint there. So that's a top tip there. So I definitely recommend checking that on a daily basis if you're out on some really hard, rugged terrain. And once again, corrugations. Okay, the next one I want to talk about is gearbox and transfer case. Now this is something that you will get to know, love, appreciate and enjoy. And maybe not all of them, but hopefully some of them. Your gearbox in your transfer case is probably, after the motor, one of the most critical components actually in the vehicle. If that fails, then you're absolutely stuffed. You can't do anything about it. You can try to, and you may be able to get yourself out of trouble, but you need presses, feeler gauges, and more importantly, you need a clean environment in order to be able to work on it. So the best thing that you can do is ensure that your gearbox and your transfer case levels, oil levels, are always absolutely 100% spot on. Now, if I'm driving out here, for example, in the goldfields of Western Australia, and obviously I'm filming this in December here, so temperatures can easily reach up to the high 30s, low 40s centigrade. It means I'm going to be checking that transfer case level and the gearbox level every single day. When I'm finished driving, I'm going to stop, I'm going to let the vehicle cool down, I'm going to have a look around the car underneath it, but I never ever do any work on the vehicle once I've finished doing a long stint. I always leave it overnight, I let it cool down, and then I tend to it the next day. It's just a lot easier. But you will regardless have to check those transmission levels, gearbox and transfer case oil levels. Because what happens, even if you have the best seal in the world, which sits between your transfer case and gearbox, what's going to happen regardless is the transfer case gets a lot hotter than the gearbox. This means that obviously the oil and the pressure inside the gearbox becomes very great, and it then actually pushes it through the actual seal and it pops it out the breather at the top. Now, because this then pushes oil, or a slight amount of oil, into the gearbox, that means the gearbox then pushes oil out of its breather. So the whole entire unit just becomes cocooned in oil, and there's nothing you can do about it. It's just the way it is. So I always recommend taking a 5-litre jerry can, and I mean steel jerry cans. Don't take the plastic variety, they're useless. And get a 5-litre one or a 10-litre one, depending on what length of the trip that you're doing, and fill it up with SAE 90 gear oil. Get another one too, and use that for your motor oil. Now the reason why you do that, and I know I'm digressing a little bit here, but using steel jerry cans of that quantity works way better than using obviously the plastic containers that the oil comes in. The reason being, if you're doing a big trip and you're doing it on corrugated roads, rough terrain, that plastic will actually slowly rub away and it will chafe through. And we actually had this happen on our Canning stock route trip, Damon and myself. And sadly for Damon, it was gear oil, and it actually went all through some of his clothes and part of his sleeping bag. And that is really, really unpleasant when you're out in the desert and you don't have the water to be able to wash that muck off effectively. So I really recommend steel jerry cans. Regardless though, you will have to check gearbox and transfer case oil levels, if I haven't made that clear already. Really need to do that. Now, if your vehicle's got freewheeling hubs, then that's great. If it hasn't, then you need to keep in mind this. You'll need to check obviously the front differential levels, oil levels, and your rear differential. If you've got freewheeling hubs, you won't have to worry about the front. You can look at the back, because obviously just the friction from the gears themselves in the differential, the oil gets quite hot, it shoots out the breather at the top, and obviously a wonderful mist of oil just goes behind the vehicle. So you need to check that too. So one of the things I recommend getting is just a 1 litre bottle of transmission oil and just emptying that into your 5 litre jerry. These little 1 litre bottles are great. They're much quicker than the little pump kits, and they've got a nice long nozzle, and you can just fill that up with, you might think, oh, I just need half a litre of oil, so you fill that up and then you pump that into the gearbox, and it's just so much quicker. So that's a top tip there. Rightio. The next thing that I'd suggest always being mindful of, coming back to steering, is obviously the studs. Depending on your setup with your front swivel hubs, they'll be at the top or the bottom, but always check them. How you do that is you actually jack up the front wheel, and I talked about this in the last Golden Quest episode, episode 4. Jack it up, and then obviously grab the back and the front part of the wheel, and then obviously just very carefully move it. And if you can't see the other wheel moving on the other side of the vehicle, then you know that obviously those studs at the top, or the nuts at the top, have come loose. And that's something you really need to keep an eye on, because if they become loose and they're left loose for a long time, what will actually happen is they'll cause the studs to obviously get fatigue fractures, they'll snap off, and then you have no steering. So it's just little things like that that you need to be mindful of. And the last thing I would say is your exhaust. Always check your exhaust, particularly at the manifold in these vehicles. They've got a yoke, and basically they've got 3 studs, and this slowly comes loose, and once again, if you don't attend to it, what will actually happen is the studs will corrode from the carbon monoxide gases coming out of the engine. They'll become very thin, they'll snap, they'll break, and then your exhaust will fall off. And I've actually had that happen. So anyway, that's some of the top tips I would say in regards to field servicing, some of the things that you need to look out for on your next big adventure. And obviously I haven't covered everything here today, because I'd be sitting here for hours and hours and hours on end. And I'm sure you guys and girls have got plenty of tips and tricks out there too that you would be willing to share with the likes of the Seriously Serious community and the World Wide Web. So if that is the case, then feel free, put a comment down below. Don't just share it with me, share it with the other Land Rover and classic off-road going enthusiasts, or the general public that are watching this video too. So anyway, we'll leave it there for today. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please let us know. I'm more than willing to do a follow-up episode on bush mechanics, which I'll talk about some of the experiences that Damon and myself have had on our intrepid adventures over the years. I'm sure there's a few things that you guys and girls might get out of that which you haven't heard before. But anyway, if you are enjoying the content here at Seriously Serious, do please consider supporting us via Patreon by clicking on the Patreon icon at the top right hand corner of your screen. And if that isn't your cup of tea, then you can visit our website at seriouslyseries.com.au by clicking on the web link in the content section down below, and you can support us via PayPal. And if you're new to the channel and you're just trying to figure out who we are, what we do and all the rest, then be sure to click on that subscribe button, click on that notification button too, and that way you won't miss out on one single video. Anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in our next video.